Look at the inside of your wrist right now, that place where the skin is thinnest, where you can sometimes see the faint blue trace of a vein running just beneath the surface. Whatever color that skin is, whatever shade, whatever warmth or coolness it carries in the lamplight or the dark of your room right now, that color is a message. Not the kind of message you might expect. Not a message about who you are, or what you are worth, or where you belong in any hierarchy that human beings have ever invented. Something far older than any of that. Something written in a language that predates every city, every nation, every word ever spoken or pressed into clay or printed on paper. That color is a record of where your ancestors stood under the sky. How much sun fell on them. More, what the light was like in the place where they lived and loved and struggled to keep their children alive through the long cold seasons or the burning equatorial summers. Your skin is not a label. It is a letter from the past. And tonight, we are going to learn to read it. The story begins, as the deepest human stories always do, in Africa. In sunlight so intense, it is almost incomprehensible from the vantage point of a northern bedroom in the quiet of a winter night. Around 300,000 years ago, and that number is worth sitting with for a moment. 300,000 years, a span of time so vast that every city ever built, every empire ever raised and fallen, every piece of writing ever produced by a human hand fits inside the last 1% of it. Around 300,000 years ago, in the open grasslands of equatorial Africa, modern human beings emerged, and every single one of them had dark skin. Not some of them, not most of them, every one of them. Every human being alive on Earth for the first 240,000 years of our species' existence had dark, melanin-rich skin. Dark brown, designed by millions of years of prior evolution to function perfectly in the environment that shaped us. This was not accidental. Nothing in evolution that touches survival this directly is accidental. Dark skin was the solution to a problem that would kill you if it went unsolved. And that problem was the African sun. Picture the landscape your earliest ancestors inhabited. Not the Africa of today, though parts of it remain close to what it was. The Africa of the Middle Pleistocene, called grasslands stretching to every horizon, broken here and there by scattered trees, rocky outcroppings, the distant silver thread of a river. The equatorial sun beating down from directly overhead at midday, with an intensity that people living in northern latitudes almost never experience. No clouds offering consistent relief. No canopy of forest filtering the light. Just open sky and open ground, and the full weight of ultraviolet radiation falling on every exposed surface. Your ancestors had recently, in evolutionary terms, done something extraordinary. They had stood up, shifted from the knuckle-walking posture of their ape relatives to the fully upright stance that defines our species. This changed everything about their relationship with the sun. When earlier primates moved on all fours, so most of their body surface was shaded by their own torso, and thick body hair provided additional protection. But when your ancestors stood upright, and when they lost most of that body hair, probably to improve the efficiency of sweating, which is one of the most remarkable cooling systems in the animal kingdom, they exposed vast areas of bare skin directly to the sky, the back of the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the face. This created what you might call an evolutionary emergency. Ultraviolet radiation is not merely uncomfortable. At the molecular level, it is destructive. It breaks chemical bonds. It damages DNA directly, over time contributing to mutations that can become cancer. But the most immediately dangerous thing UV radiation does, the thing that would have been killing your ancestors in ways they could not have named or understood, is that it destroys folate. Folate is a B vitamin, and folate is not optional. not if you want to reproduce successfully. Folate is essential to the process of DNA replication during cell division, which means it is essential to the formation of every new cell in a growing embryo. When folate levels drop too low, neural tubes fail to close properly. Spinal cords do not form correctly. Pregnancies fail or produce children who cannot survive. In adults, folate deficiency causes anemia, weakened immunity, slow healing. In the brutal calculus of prehistoric survival, where every healthy birth mattered enormously and every healthy adult was essential to the group's continued existence, folate deficiency was not a chronic condition to be managed. It was a death sentence delivered slowly across generations. Studies have shown that just a few hours of intense UV exposure can degrade folate levels in the bloodstream by more than half. Now imagine you are a human being in prehistoric Africa, spending 12 hours a day outside, hunting, gathering, walking between water sources, doing every single thing that keeping yourself and your family alive requires. Without protection, your folate reserves would be depleted constantly. The sun would be quietly dismantling your ability to reproduce, to heal, to maintain the most basic functions of a body under stress. And this is where melanin enters the story. Melanin is produced by specialized cells called melanocytes that live in the deepest layer of your skin. It comes in several forms, but the most important for UV protection is eumelanin, the brown-black pigment that gives darker skin its color. What melanin does is act as billions of microscopic shields distributed throughout the skin, absorbing UV radiation and dissipating it as heat before it can penetrate to the deeper layers where blood vessels and living cells reside. Dark brown skin can absorb and neutralize UV radiation dozens of times more effectively than pale skin. It is not a perfect solution, nothing in biology is, but it is a remarkably elegant one. In the environment where human beings evolved, this protection was not an advantage. It was a requirement. Women with insufficient melanin would have suffered higher rates of pregnancy failure and birth defects. Their children would have been more vulnerable to the cumulative damage of a lifetime under an equatorial sun. Natural selection does not compromise on problems this fundamental. Any genetic variation that increased melanin production in that environment spread rapidly through the population. Within a few thousand generations, an eye blink in geological time, every human being in equatorial Africa had dark skin. And this is where the story stood for a very long time. For 240,000 years of our existence as a species, the genetic variations that would eventually produce lighter skin either did not exist, or, when they arose as random mutations, were quickly selected against, or eliminated by the merciless logic of a sun-drenched environment where they provided no benefit and posed real danger. There was one kind of human being in the world, and that human being was dark. Then something changed. And that change is the heart of tonight's story, beginning perhaps 60,000 years ago, and in waves that continued for tens of thousands of years afterward. Small groups of human beings began to leave Africa. Why they left, and why at that particular time, is still a question science is actively working to answer. Climate shifts may have opened corridors through previously impassable desert. Growing populations may have pushed groups toward the edges of their familiar territory. Curiosity, which is, in its way, or as much a survival trait as melanin, may have drawn certain individuals and certain communities toward the horizon simply because it was there. However, they made the decision. They went through the narrow land bridge at what is now the Sinai Peninsula, across the southern coast of Asia, following the shoreline in small boats or on foot, into the interior of a continent that no human being had ever seen, up through the Middle East and into the heart of Asia, and eventually into Europe. And some of them, pushed by the slow, irresistible drift of generations into latitudes so far from the equator that the sun itself was different. Not weaker, exactly, not absent, but lower in the sky, filtered through more atmosphere, arriving at a sharper angle that spread its energy across more surface area. In winter, disappearing for months, In these northern latitudes, the problem that melanin had evolved to solve was not a problem anymore. In fact, melanin became part of a new problem. Because here is the thing about ultraviolet radiation, that the story of dark skin's protective function does not by itself explain. UV radiation, the same radiation that destroys folate, also triggers the synthesis of something essential: vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in the skin when UVB radiation interacts with a form of cholesterol present in skin cells, converting it through a chain of chemical reactions into the active form of the vitamin. And vitamin D is, like folate, not optional. It is essential to bone development and maintenance. Without sufficient vitamin D, children develop rickets, a condition in which bones fail to harden properly, producing skeletal deformities, growth failure, weakness. In adults, vitamin D deficiency leads to softening of the bones, muscle weakness, immune dysfunction, and cascading health problems that would have been severely limiting in the context of prehistoric survival. In Africa, under intense equatorial sunlight, this was not a concern. Even very dark skin, with all its UV filtering capacity, allows enough radiation through to produce adequate vitamin D when the sun is strong and exposure is long. But in northern latitudes, where the sun is weaker and winter may bring months of near darkness, the calculus changes completely. Dark skin, which evolved to protect against too much UV radiation, now became a liability. It was filtering out precisely the radiation that the body needed to produce the vitamin D that kept bones strong and immune systems functional and pregnancies healthy. And so the same pressure that had locked in dark skin at the equator began in these northern latitudes to push in the opposite direction. Individuals with mutations that reduced melanin production, whose skin was lighter, who produced more vitamin D under the weak northern sun, were healthier. Their children had stronger bones. They survived the winters better. They reproduced more successfully. And their genes spread. This is where modern genetics has produced some of its most startling revelations. Because when scientists began sequencing the genomes of ancient Europeans, pulling DNA from bones buried for thousands of years and reading the sequences that controlled skin pigmentation, what they found overturned assumptions that had seemed obvious. The people who first settled Europe, who arrived perhaps 40,000 years ago, following the coasts and river valleys, as the ice sheets of the last ice age shifted and opened corridors into new territory, were not white. They were not even close to white. The ancient hunter-gatherers of Europe, the people who painted the cave walls at Lascaux and Altamira, who made the bone flutes and the carved figurines, who built the first shelters in the cold landscapes north of the Mediterranean, had dark brown skin, sometimes quite dark. Comparable, in many genetic studies, to populations living in sub-Saharan Africa today. This is not what anyone expected. The assumption had been that European paleness was ancient, that it arrived with the first settlers, that the connection between northern latitudes and light skin was so direct and so strong that it must have happened quickly. But the DNA said otherwise. The mutations that produce the pale skin of modern northern Europeans are, in many cases, only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Some may be even more recent than that. By the standards of our species' history, that is essentially yesterday. Agriculture is older. The city of Jericho is older. The skin color we associate most strongly with European appearance arrived, in genetic terms, after humans had already been living in Europe for 30,000 years. What changed 10,000 years ago? What accelerated a process that had apparently been proceeding slowly, or not at all, for 3 times as long? The answer is farming. When agriculture arrived in Europe, spreading from the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, carried by populations of Anatolian farmers who migrated northward and westward and mixed with the existing hunter-gatherer populations, it changed the human diet in a way that had profound consequences for skin color. Hunter-gatherers eat a wide and varied diet. They eat fish, which is rich in vitamin D. They eat animal fat and organ meat, which carry fat-soluble vitamins. They eat seasonally and opportunistically. And while this life was hard in many ways, their nutritional profile was in some respects excellent. Farmers, especially early farmers, eat very differently. They eat grain. Grain is calorie-dense and storable and feeds more people per acre than any hunting and gathering lifestyle can sustain. But grain is poor in vitamin D. A population that switches from a varied hunter-gatherer diet to a grain-based agricultural diet suddenly loses much of its dietary source of vitamin D. In a northern latitude where sunlight is already weak and seasonal, this creates a new and urgent pressure. Now the body's ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight becomes even more critical. Any mutation that allows more UV radiation to penetrate, that lightens the skin even slightly, becomes even more strongly selected for. The convergence of migration, latitude, diet, and the specific UV environment of Northern Europe created a set of pressures that were extraordinarily strong. An evolution, which is not purposeful, which has no goal or direction, which simply amplifies whatever variation happens to produce more surviving offspring, responded. The frequency of skin-lightening mutations climbed. Generation by generation, the population's average complexion shifted. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic transformation, but steadily, over thousands of years, the people of Northern Europe became paler. What makes this story stranger and more interesting than a simple linear narrative is that the same problem, insufficient UV radiation at high latitudes, was solved independently in different populations by different genetic means. The mutations that lighten the skin of Northern Europeans are not the same as the mutations that lighten the skin of people from East Asia. They are different changes in different genes that arrive through different pathways at different times, all converging on a similar outcome because the selective pressure was similar. Two separate evolutionary experiments running in parallel, arriving at comparable results through entirely different mechanisms. This is something worth holding in the mind for a moment, because it upends a certain way of thinking about human diversity. If you see a very pale person from Sweden and a very pale person from northern China standing side by side, a casual observer might note their similar skin tone and assign them to the same broad category. But their paleness is, at the genetic level, the result of different mutations in different genes, mutations that arose thousands of miles apart, thousands of years apart, or in populations that had no contact with each other. Their shared paleness is not evidence of shared ancestry in any recent sense. It is evidence that evolution, faced with the same problem in two different places, found two different solutions that happen to look similar from the outside. Meanwhile, in Africa, no such pressure ever developed. The sun remained intense. Foliar protection remained essential. The genetic variants that produced dark skin remained strongly selected for, and the populations that stayed in or near the equatorial zone maintained the deep melanin protection that had been the original human condition. Not because they failed to evolve, not because they were stuck in some primitive state, but because the environment they lived in had not changed in ways that would make lighter skin beneficial. Evolution, as always, answered the question the environment was actually asking. Meanwhile, in Africa, no such pressure ever developed. The sun remained intense. Foliar protection remained essential. The genetic variants that produced dark skin remained strongly selected for, and the populations that stayed in or near the equatorial zone maintained the deep melanin protection that had been the original human condition. Not because they failed to evolve, not because they were stuck in some primitive state, but because the environment they lived in had not changed in ways that would make lighter skin beneficial. Evolution, as always, answered the question the environment was actually asking. There is another layer to this story that most people never hear, and it concerns beings who are not quite human in the way we are, but who are human enough to matter in the deep history of our skin. When the first waves of modern humans moved out of Africa and into Eurasia, they did not enter an empty world. Other human species were already there. The Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, well adapted to cold climates, with bodies built for the Ice Age world in ways that modern humans had not yet developed. In the Far East, a group called the Denisovans, known to us today almost entirely from tiny fragments of bone and the DNA extracted from them, occupied the vast landscapes of Asia. Modern humans did not simply replace these populations, they met them. And in the way of every encounter between human groups across the entire span of our history, they sometimes merged with them. We carry their genes today. Most people of non-African ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. People from certain Pacific Island populations carry significant amounts of Denisovan DNA. These encounters happened over thousands of years, in small groups, in the borderlands between territories, in the slow, inevitable way that populations mix when they share the same landscape and the same general needs. And some of those inherited genes affect skin and hair and appearance in ways that scientists are still mapping. Certain variants related to skin tone and hair texture in modern populations trace back not to ancient African ancestors or to the evolutionary pressures of European latitudes, but to those long-ago meetings with people who were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of a completely different evolutionary history. Your body may carry, in some small fraction, the solution that Neanderthals evolved for surviving the cold, dark winters of Ice Age Europe. That inheritance is part of the story of how human skin color became what it is today. The migration waves themselves deserve more attention because they were not a single event. They were a series of pulses spread across tens of thousands of years, each wave carrying its own genetic profile into new territories, mixing with whatever populations it found there, and producing the layered, complex mosaic of ancestry that underlies every living human being today. The first movement out of Africa, perhaps 60 to 70,000 years ago, carried a small founder population, probably no more than a few thousand individuals, through the Arabian Peninsula and along the southern coast of Asia. These were the ancestors of all non-African people alive today, and they moved fast by the standards of ancient migration. Within perhaps 20,000 years, their descendants had reached Australia, which required at minimum some kind of water crossing, and the remote edges of Southeast Asia. They were dark-skinned. The environments they moved through, along tropical coasts, through the warmth of southern Asia, did not yet demand lighter skin. Later, waves moved northward and westward. Some populations followed the great river valleys into the interior of Asia and eventually across the land bridge that connected Asia to North America, populating two continents that had never known a human footprint. Others curved toward Europe, arriving in waves across tens of thousands of years. First, the ancient hunter-gatherers, whose dark skin the DNA studies have revealed. Then, the Anatolian farmers, whose arrival with agriculture would accelerate the skin-lightening process. And then later, still another wave of steppe pastoralists from what is now Ukraine and Russia, who carried yet more genetic variation into the mixing pool that became the European population. Each of these migrations brought its own genetic cargo. Each met and mixed with whatever had come before. The population of modern Europe, for example, one is not a single lineage. It is a palimpsest, layers of different ancestries written over each other across 40,000 years, each addition changing the composition slightly, each new mixture creating something that had not existed in exactly that form before. The skin tones and features of modern Europeans are the product of all those layers, averaged and blended and selected by 10,000 years of farming-driven pressure toward lighter skin at the end. The farming connection is worth dwelling on for a moment longer, because it is genuinely surprising in its implications. Agriculture is usually thought of as a cultural development, a change in how people organize their relationship with food and land and community. And it is all of those things. But it is also, in a very direct sense, a change in the evolutionary environment that operates on human bodies. When you shift a population from a varied hunter-gatherer diet to a grain-based agricultural diet, you change the nutritional landscape in ways that natural selection can act on. This happened not just with vitamin D and skin color, but with other traits as well. Lactase persistence, the genetic ability to digest milk into adulthood, which most mammals lose after weaning, became much more common in farming populations that kept dairy animals, because the ability to extract nutrition from milk provided a significant advantage in a world where reliable calories were precious. The ability to digest starchy foods efficiently changed in farming populations. Even the shape of teeth shows signs of selection related to dietary change in the archaeological record. The human body is not fixed. It is not a finished product delivered at one moment in evolutionary history and unchanged since. It is an ongoing experiment, still responding to the environments its owners inhabit, still shifting its frequencies in response to the pressures of each generation. Your genome is not ancient. Parts of it are ancient. The deep structures, the basic biochemistry, the fundamental architecture of cells. But the surface details, the things that make you look the way you look, are often far more recent than you might expect, and they are still, right now, in motion. And then there are the populations that sit in between, the vast majority of humanity, in fact, who have complexions that fall somewhere along the gradient between the deepest ebony and the palest ivory. Each of these complexions represents its own particular history, its own set of latitudes and UV environments and diets and migrations and admixtures of populations that had previously been separate. The golden brown of South Asian populations, the warm olive of the Mediterranean, the reddish tones that appear in certain indigenous American groups, the extraordinary range of African complexions, which span more genetic diversity than any other region on Earth. Because Africa is where our species spent most of its existence and accumulated most of its variation. None of these complexions exist because one group of people is more evolved than another, or because some ancient separation produced fundamentally different kinds of human beings. They exist because a single species, extraordinarily flexible and extraordinarily mobile, walked into every climate and every latitude the planet offered, and slowly, over generations, bent its body to fit the light. The science that has established all of this is relatively recent. For most of recorded history, human beings sorted themselves by visible differences and constructed elaborate stories about what those differences meant. Entire systems of law and economy and social organization were built on the premise that the visible differences in skin tone, in facial features, in hair texture, corresponded to deep and fundamental differences in capability, in intelligence, in moral worth. These systems were not built on evidence. They were built on the fact that power required justification, and the bodies of people who looked different provided a convenient vocabulary for that justification. Modern genetics has not simply complicated those old stories, it has demolished their biological foundation entirely. When scientists look at the human genome, at the full 3 billion base pairs of DNA that carry the instructions for building and running a human body, what they find is that the genetic differences between human populations are extraordinarily small. About 99.9% of the human genome is identical in every person alive. That remaining 0.1% accounts for everything that varies between individuals and between populations: height, eye color, hair texture, disease susceptibility, and yes, skin color. All of visible human diversity squeezed into a fraction of a fraction, and within that tiny sliver of variation, skin color is controlled by a relatively small number of genes. The mutations that produce the full range of human complexions from deepest to palest involve perhaps a dozen genetic variants of significance. Out of 20,000 genes in the human genome, the number of genes separating the darkest and the palest human skin is so small, so proportionally insignificant, that calling it a fundamental biological distinction is like pointing to the color of a car's paint job and claiming it tells you everything important about the engine. But there is something even more striking in the data. When population geneticists measure genetic diversity, when they ask how different people are from each other at the level of their actual DNA, they find consistently that most human genetic variation exists within populations, not between them. Two people from the same ethnic group, from the same village in the same country, may be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from someone on the other side of the planet. The boundaries we draw, the categories we name, the identities we have organized entire civilizations around, these do not map onto the actual structure of human genetic variation in the way they seem to. The variation is real but continuous, It bleeds across borders. It refuses to sort itself into the neat boxes our social systems have created. Walk from the equator to the Arctic, step by step, village by village, and you will not find a series of sudden jumps from one race to another. You will find a gradual shift, a slow wash of change, as skin tones lighten and facial features adjust and body proportions respond to the centuries of accumulated selection in each particular climate. The world at the genetic level is not a patchwork. It is a watercolor, with colors bleeding into each other at every edge. There is a thought that comes from all of this which is worth carrying with you into sleep. Every human being alive tonight, in every city, every village, every tent and apartment and house and field anywhere on this planet, is descended from a group of people who very nearly did not make it. The human population went through at least one catastrophic bottleneck, possibly more, in our early history. At points in the deep past, the total number of human beings alive on Earth may have dropped to a few thousand individuals, perhaps fewer. The thread connecting you to the present is thin and has been cut close many times. Every person alive is the improbable end of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back 300,000 years. Every single ancestor in that chain managed to survive long enough to reproduce at least once, managed to keep their children alive long enough to do the same, through ice ages and droughts and the deaths of species all around them and the slow, grinding difficulty of daily existence in a world without medicine or infrastructure or any of the accumulated knowledge that modern human life is built upon. Every cell in your body is the legacy of that chain. The genes that give your skin its particular color, whatever it is, are part of what was selected for and maintained across that entire, improbable arc. Somewhere at the beginning of the chain, in sunlight, your body was built to remember. A small group of dark-skinned humans who had nearly vanished kept going. The entire genetic diversity of 8 billion people flows from them. Every shade of human skin, every variation in every feature, is a descendant of that original population. There is no pure group that stands outside this lineage. There is no branch of humanity that did not pass through that African origin. We are all variations on the same ancient theme, remixed and recombined in different proportions by the long journey of migration and time. Your skin, whatever shade it is your chapter's cover art. The book beneath is the same one everyone else is carrying. As you lie here in the quiet, as the thoughts begin to soften at their edges and the body begins the slow work of settling into sleep, you can let the details drift. The genetics, the latitudes, the evolutionary pressures, the specific names of the mutations and the populations, all of that can blur and fade like footsteps in the sand as the tide comes in. What does not need to fade, what can travel with you into whatever the night brings, is something simpler. The color of human skin is a record of where people stood under the sky, of how much light fell on them, of what the winters were like, and how much fish they ate, and how close to the equator their grandmothers lived. It is a beautiful and intricate record. Every shade is its own kind of answer to its own set of questions. The deep ebony of equatorial populations is a record of a sun so intense it had to be held at bay. The olive of the Mediterranean is a record of a climate mild enough to need less protection, but not so dim as to demand none. The paleness of Scandinavia is a record of winters so long and so dark that every photon of ultraviolet light became precious. None of these answers is better than the others. They are all correct. They are all the right answer to the question the local environment was asking. The variation between them is not a hierarchy. It is a weather report from different latitudes written in the language of biology. Think about what it means that these changes happened so recently. The farming revolution that accelerated skin lightening in Europe began around 10,000 years ago. The specific mutations most strongly associated with the paleness of modern Northern Europeans arrived perhaps 6,000 years ago. In the context of 300,000 years of human existence, that is a tiny sliver of time. The last 1 or 2% of the story, the person with the palest skin imaginable, is carrying, in the vast majority of their genome, the same ancient African inheritance as everyone else. The surface changed recently under specific pressures, in specific places. The depth remained the same. What modern genetics tells us in the clearest possible language is that the categories human beings have created around visible differences are real in the sense that the differences themselves are real, and not real in the sense that they reflect any deep or fundamental division in what it means to be human. The genetic distance between the most physically different-looking human populations is vanishingly small compared to the genetic distance between, say, chimpanzee populations living a few hundred miles apart. We are an extraordinarily homogeneous species wearing an extraordinary variety of clothes. The ancient bottleneck is part of the reason for this. When your ancestors came within thousands of individuals of extinction, when the entire human lineage was compressed into a population so small that any disease or drought or volcanic winter could have ended everything, the genetic diversity that might otherwise have accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years was erased. What we have now, all the variation of 8 billion people, rebuilt from that near nothing. That near extinction is in some sense the reason for both our diversity and our fundamental similarity. We are varied enough to have found every climate on Earth hospitable. We are similar enough that any two people anywhere on the planet can, if circumstances allow, produce children together. We are one species. The genetics say this without ambiguity, without qualification, without any room for the old stories that tried to complicate the answer. And beneath all of it, beneath every variation in pigment and feature, and the endless subtle gradations of human appearance, the similarities are overwhelming. The same bones, the same muscles, the same neural architecture that lights up when a child laughs, or a song arrives suddenly in your memory, or a story pulls you in even when you are very tired, and it is very late. The same ancient brain that learned to make fire, to plant seeds, to build shelter, to care for strangers, to ask why the sky is that color, to reach toward whatever is beyond the next horizon. The same brain that right now, in whatever state of wakefulness or drowsiness you have arrived at, is doing the extraordinarily complex and mostly unconscious work of keeping you alive, regulating your temperature, managing the chemistry of your blood, cycling through the stages of rest that repair and consolidate and prepare you for another day under whatever sky you happen to live beneath. Wherever you are tonight, whatever your skin looks like in the dim light of your room, you are part of one continuous human story. A story that is much older than any of the divisions that have been imposed on it. A story that was written first in Africa, or in sunlight, in the bodies of people who had no words for the categories we have invented since. A story that has been moving outward and onward ever since, finding new climates, new latitudes, new challenges, bending and adapting and continuing without ever once stopping. The sun that shaped your ancestors' skin will rise again on a planet full of people, all of them carrying some version of the same long, improbable inheritance. All of them, in the deepest sense that biology can speak. Family. Not metaphorically, literally. Separated by geography and time and the accumulated differences that 60,000 years of separate paths produce, but connected, underneath, by the same origin, the same near extinction, the same extraordinary resilience of a species that should not, by any reasonable calculation, have survived what it survived and become what it has become. Let your eyes close now. Let the breath come slow and easy. The story keeps going without you, has been going long before you arrived in it, will continue long after tonight. You are one note in something very long and very beautiful, and you do not have to hold all of it. You only have to be here, in this moment, in the body that 300,000 years of survival produced for you. That is enough. that has always been enough. Sleep well.